If you're looking to learn more about M3 expeditions in New World Aeternum, then this video is for you. Regardless on whether or not you're a seasoned veteran or just stepping foot into Aeternum, M3 expeditions are where the real challenges and rewards actually begin. In this video, we'll arm you with everything you need to know in order to conquer these in-depth dungeons. From essential gear and weapon choices to must-know strategies and tips, this video guide will ensure you're not just surviving, but also thriving. Ready to take a deep dive? Let's go ahead and get started. Before we jump into how we are going to be preparing for these expeditions, let's make sure we understand what exactly we're getting ourselves into. Within the Activities tab of New World Aeternum, you'll see the large red circle icon that calls out Mutated Expeditions. When you click into that, you're going to see 3 different expeditions in this main menu. Every week, there is a mix of 3 different expeditions that are offered as a mutated option. These will change every week and be updated to a listing of 3 different expeditions every Tuesday. So if there's not a specific expedition that you want a specific artifact drop from or certain drops, then just wait until the following week for another chance of that expedition actually being mutated. When we jump into this next tab, we can get a better idea of the fact that each level of mutation, there is some sort of added buff to the enemies or a debuff to the players within the expedition. At M3, the enemies are going to be by far the highest level and most difficult to defeat, as well as having these 3 different mutated buffs slash debuffs associated with the enemies and the players within it. These are typically associated with specific elements. As you can see, barnacles and black powder, M3 this week, there are a lot of nature-specific debuffs that are associated and nature-specific buffs that are associated with the enemies within this dungeon. And it also actually impacts the items that could potentially drop from this expedition. As we scroll down here, we can actually get a better idea of some mutator-specific rewards. And these are all hinted green, right? Because they're typically utilizing what that nature's element is within the actual drop. These are actually great transmogs too, especially the fire ones. They look super cool. So it's just an added benefit of jumping into these mutated expeditions at getting a better chance of getting a cool transmog and also some pretty great items. One thing that is very important to note is that you want to make sure that your team fit a certain amount of guidelines before you even step foot into these M3 expeditions. For example, you want to make sure that every player, including yourself in the group, is at level 65, which is the current level cap in New World Aeternum. Next up, which also is very, very important, is that you want to make sure that your overall average gear score per player is at least 695. This is very important. Please note that text on the bottom that calls out that lower than the recommended minimum gear score results in doing less damage and taking more damage from enemies in the expedition. This is not only a debuff on yourself, but also the rest of your team. And I have experimented with this before, and it is a huge debuff. You will barely be doing any damage, and they will be hitting you much, much harder. So make sure, even if you have to put on a piece that is not ideal, if it means that it's hitting that 695 threshold, make sure you do it. Otherwise, it's going to be almost impossible to actually get through these dungeons just based on how heavy this debuff really hits you and your team. Next up, there are some requirements here. One thing to call out is that it's really class-based when it comes to these expeditions, but you are not 100% locked in. For example, I have seen a few people actually enter these with 1 tank and 4 DPS. I've seen people enter with 4 DPS and 1 healer. Some people are just a little bit more con and they make it work. Or there's kind of like a Void Gauntlet heavy DPS user that kind of switches to the life staff here and there. There's lots of different ways and how you can actually form your team. But by far the most common and probably the most successful when it comes to just starting out with these M3s is making sure you have 3 DPS users, 1 tank, and 1 healer. What I'm going to go ahead and do is share a handful of useful PvE guides in the top right corner right now of this video. Go ahead and explore these guides throughout this site because it will help you get started on the overall skills and abilities that you're actually going to want to utilize based on which of these 3 roles you're going to be playing. So in today's video, I'm going to be showcasing the equipment and perks and abilities that I typically like utilizing when it comes to a DPS role in M3 expeditions. One thing I do want to call out is that there are some perks and abilities that are useful across the board. For example, the 2 perks that I think are useful regardless if you are a tank, a healer, or even a DPS user is Enchanted Ward and Refreshing. There is a handful of named items that you can upgrade directly to 700 gear score just by utilizing the gypsum kiln. That's called the Azoth Crystal set. Again, there are multiple pieces to this set. You can get it in light, medium, and heavy. Check it out. It's 100% worth looking at and crafting when it comes to M3 expeditions just because of how useful this is and the fact that it comes with great perks. As you can tell, these 2 pieces essentially are basically free. Again, not 100% because you do have to get the items, you have to craft it, you need the matrix, but you don't need a specific type of crafting level. You don't need to buy it for some crazy expensive price. You'll be able to handle this and set it up yourself. So again, Enchanted Ward and Refreshing are both very useful throughout M3 expeditions and just PvE content in general. If you are utilizing a light DPS build, I do want to kind of call out the fact that you want to make sure you hit your weight restriction, right? So you're going to want a mix of light and medium gear in order to hit within that light threshold. If you are a DPS role within an M3 expedition, you basically have to be in light. Again, you can get through it if you're a medium, but typically group leaders will not accept DPS players that are medium or heavy just because your overall damage output is decreased. Again, M3 expeditions are typically considered the end game content when it comes to PvE content in New World Aeternum. So people are pretty sweaty and people are pretty picky. You want to make sure you are dishing off as much DPS as possible if you are a DPS role within these M3 expeditions. Again, when it comes to perks, you are going to want to utilize Refreshing and Enchanted Ward over everything else if you are a light DPS. Health is a nice cushion. If you have it, go ahead and throw it in. But other than that, you do want to also make sure you're utilizing any specific weapon perks that make your build more useful to the overall success rate. For example, I utilize the rapier and the spear for my light DPS build. And on my rapier, I make sure I am using both rogue for additional backstab damage. So I'm always trying to be behind the enemies that I take down. And then also, probably most importantly, when it comes to spear builds, is enfeebling skewer on my spear. It allows me to apply weaken to enemies, including boss enemies within M3 expeditions, reducing their damage by 47% for 8 seconds. Now, let me say that again. I am reducing the target's damage by 47% for 8 seconds. I can rinse and repeat this based on my overall refreshing, working with my build to make sure I am dishing off this weaken on the enemies as much as possible. Just because the fact that I'm debuffing my enemy means that they're typically doing almost half the damage they would on a day-by-day basis to myself and my team members. It's pretty recommended, honestly, that at least one DPS player within each build is utilizing a spear with enfeebling skewer on it just to make sure they take advantage of this weekend. When it comes to my rapier, I do enjoy using the finisher artifact. It just dishes off a ton of damage and allows me to apply bleeds, which also works pretty well with my spear. Again, depending on how you're setting this up, you are going to have a little bit of a different build. You're going to have different weapon perks you're going to want to prioritize, and you're really just going to have to make it work based on what your overall goal is. Next up, when it comes to M3 expeditions as well, you're going to want to make sure you take a close look at what that debuff is that I shared earlier. In the example I shared in the beginning of this video, it was nature, but let's say hypothetically that the debuff was void damage. You can see that I am utilizing cut pristine void gems in a good chunk of my equipment here. If I'm not using a void gem, I typically like using these gems here that provide an elemental damage absorption across the board. So before I jump into that M3 expedition, I would typically swap these out as well to get some more basic coverage. Again, I'm using a lot of void damage absorption gems because there's going to be a lot of void damage that's targeted to me. As a light DPS, I am going to be very, very squishy, and I'm going to want to make sure that I am dishing off as much damage as possible, but also not being completely blown away if I get hit once or twice. When it comes to elemental damage resistance, you can see in the bottom here that I have 47.4% void damage resistance, which is just below the cap. Again, if I put void gems in everything, then I'm going to be actually over the cap, which is 50% right now. So keep a close eye on what these numbers are. Again, if you are going into a specific M3 expedition that has a lot of one specific element, you want to make sure you are covered and just overall surviving these hits because they do hit extremely hard. One other note is that your amulet actually has a specific perk that could provide a large chunk of elemental protection. For example, there's void protection. There is a perk for every single element that you can apply to your amulet. I recommend having a different amulet for every single type of perk so that you can utilize this for M3 expeditions based on what's on the table that specific week. Plus, 15% is a huge chunk, which allows me to utilize a few gems in a few different areas if I wanted to. The other item I do want to call out is the fact when it comes to your ring, you want to make sure that you are utilizing the Hardy perk, which gives you additional stamina, which allows you to have a little bit more flexibility and increase your overall survivability. Other than that, I do highly recommend that you pick up a damage specific perk. Again, I'm using the spear and the rapier, which both utilize thrust damage. So I made sure that I had this thrust damage bonus just to give myself that 7% thrust damage boost and helping myself and my team take down enemies at a faster rate. When it comes to consumables that you want to make sure you have within your slots when entering an M3 expedition, I highly recommend that you utilize infused health potions, infused regeneration potions, and then for the other perks, you have some more flexibility. One of the important elements that I like to include within my M3 expedition builds is making sure I have some absorption potions based on what the element within that M3 expedition is. For example, if I know that all of the bosses and maybe the main boss within the expedition utilizes the element of fire, then I will bring in a few of these fire absorption potions just to boost my survivability so I don't end up falling and ruining my team's chances of actually completing the expedition. Next up, this is very important. Based on which dungeon you are entering, you want to make sure you have specific infused coatings, which applies a huge damage buff to your weapons on specific mob types. Again, there are specific mob types that are weakened to certain types of weapon damage, and again, these are specific to the mob type. As you can see, this is a Angry Earth coating. So if I am entering a M3 Genesis expedition, I know that a majority of the mobs within that expedition are Angry Earth. So I'm going to make sure I have at least 2 of these so that I can apply them to both of my weapons before entering the dungeon, just to dish off as much damage as possible. Other than that, you also want to make sure you have a specific attribute food based on what you want to max out within your build. Typically, this will be either Constitution or one of your specific DPS attributes that scale with your weapons. So for me, it would probably be Dexterity, just to make sure it scales with both my spear and my rapier. Other than the attribute food, you will want to make sure you utilize some hearty meals and then also a powerful honing stone. This, once again, is a huge weapon boost to your overall damage. It's a 7% just all around damage boost. It does count towards your empower cap, but regardless, you want to make sure you have this just so you're dishing off as much damage as possible. Other than that, I do also like using powerful incenses, which allows you to have a little bit more resistance. Again, I typically go into M3s with very low constitution just so I can dish off as much damage as possible. So I want to make sure I have all my areas covered and max out my overall survivability. If you are going in strictly to do some item hunting too, you might want to consider using a specific consumable that actually increases your luck, such as a Defiled Rabbit's Foot, which again is a event-specific drop that will come around the Easter time frame. But there are a handful of other types of consumables out there too that could increase your overall luck. So keep your eyes open for those once they pop up. When it comes to the overall attribute mix, it really depends on what your role is within your M3 expedition group. If you are a healer, I've seen a large portion of M3 healers actually dump around 400 in focus, which is a lot, right? But your main goal in this is to keep you and your team members alive, so that's why they do that. They dump 400 in focus and then everything left over into constitution. If you are a tank, typically I do see a pretty good chunk going to strength based on what weapons they are utilizing. A lot of times tanks will use sword and shield with a warhammer or some sort of mix when it comes to utilizing flail and shield, or just making sure that the shield is in there somewhere. Typically I have seen a lot of tanks actually test their lucks and get up to 300, maybe even 350 strength and dishing everything else off into constitution. But again, if you want to play it safe, make sure you do have a lot of constitution, because your goal and overall role in this expedition is to, one, distract the mobs, and two, not die from them, so you can just take the hits consistently as your team members dish off more damage. A lot of these tanks tend to use a lot more strength just so they can actually dish off a lot of damage themselves too and try to burn down these enemies at a faster rate. When you are a DPS, typically, I mean, even 117 constitution is quite a lot for these speed runners. Typically, we see people run anywhere from like 25 to 100 constitution. If this is your first one, maybe add a little bit more, such as like 117, but you really don't want to go anywhere over 150 because again, your overall goal and role in this role is to dish off as much damage as possible. That's why you'll see that I am hitting specific attribute bonus thresholds here to dish off as much damage as possible. Both of my weapons scale off of dexterity. I've got that maxed out at 350. I am utilizing a bleed build that is also using some specific elements. So that's why I have some intelligence there to scale with my rapier. Honestly, I'm dishing off a majority of my damage with my rapier. And that's why I have a lot more in intelligence too, because dexterity and intelligence is what scales with my rapier. I do have some in strength as well, just to dish off additional light attack damage and heavy attack damage where necessary. But really, this 25 threshold here helps me a lot with my specific build. Just because you have the best possible gear, attribute mix, weapon skills, team, attributes, and everything else does not mean that you are going to be successful in M3 expeditions. Every boss fight in every expedition has a unique set of mechanics. Be sure to take a close look at all of these boss fights so you're prepared and don't end up dead just like this guy on the screen. And again, if you guys want to learn a little bit more about each of these in-depth dynamic fights in each of these expeditions, check out the pinned comment in the comment section below, where you'll be able to just take a deep dive into some written guides on all the ins and outs of every single expedition, just to make sure you are prepared for your M3 expeditions now and into the future. Thanks again for watching. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to like and hit that subscribe button, because you've got a whole lot more New World content coming your way. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys later.